She was about to sign 51 pages. One pen. 9 people watching her hand move toward the page that would end everything she had built across 23 years. The tips touched paper. And then the door opened. 3 people walked in who had not been invited and were not going to apologize for it. The woman in front held up a badge without slowing down. She did not look at the chairman, did not look at the lawyers. Her eyes went directly with the precision of someone who has already done this 100 times to the man sitting 2 chairs to the left of the CEO. Nobody moved, the pen lifted off the page. The man she was looking at had arrived that morning carrying coffee. He had prepared talking points. He had sat in this room for 16 years as the person everyone trusted most. Now he was looking at the CEO across the table with an expression that had no clean name, not surprise, not guilt, something older and colder than either. The federal agent spoke 4 sentences, and somewhere far below, in a basement that no one in this room had ever visited, a man who cleaned floors for a living sat very still and waited. 2:07 a.m., 48th floor. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does at this hour, humming, breathing. Moving freight through intersections that belong to trucks after midnight, the city's second shift, running invisible beneath the one everyone sees in daylight. James Smith was not thinking about any of that. He was pushing his cart down a hallway that smelled like recycled air and carpet cleaner. The same hallway he had pushed a cart down 300 and some nights in a row, and he was not thinking about anything except whether the mop head needed replacing and whether the last office on the left had run out of hand soap again. The wheels on the cart made a sound like a question mark every time they hit the seam between the elevator bay and the main corridor. Small squeak, barely there. The kind of sound that only exists because everything else is that quiet. He liked the quiet. That was the truth he had settled into over 3.5 years of night shifts at Crestline Systems. The quiet was not empty. The quiet was the arrangement. You give us the hours nobody wants. We give you the building to yourself. No performance reviews. No team lunches, where everyone laughed a beat, too late at things that were not funny. No one stopping in a doorway to ask where you saw yourself in 5 years. James Smith did not see himself anywhere in 5 years. He saw himself at the end of this hallway, finishing the last 3 offices, clocking out at 6. Walking left on Wabash to the corner diner, ordering black coffee and scrambled eggs, going back to his apartment in Pilsen, and sleeping until 2 in the afternoon. That was the plan. It had been the plan every night for 3.5 years, and it carried the specific comfort of something that never needed revision. Until tonight, the light at the end of the hall was on. Not the overhead fluorescents. Those were motion-activated, cutting off automatically when the floor emptied around 7:30 at the latest. This was different. A desk lamp, angled, pushing a thin wedge of warm light through the gap under the corner office door like something left on by accident. James stopped the cart. He stood there for a moment just listening. No voices, no keyboard, no phone call bleeding through the wall. Just that strip of light and the building doing what old buildings do at this hour, the steel and glass, making small adjustments to temperature and pressure, and the general fact of existing through another night. His first read was reasonable. Someone forgot a lamp, an assistant maybe, or a junior analyst who left in a hurry. He had seen it before. He would go in, empty the trash, wipe the glass, leave the lamp alone because it was not his to touch, and move on. Sybil. He pushed the cart forward, reached the door, pushed it open. Sandra Anderson was in the chair. James did not know her name at that exact moment. He knew her face the way you know the face of someone you have seen on a television in a waiting room, familiar, without being personal, present without being real. She appeared on the lobby screen every morning when he arrived for his shift. One of 2 faces above words that someone in marketing had chosen, and no one had questioned since. She was the one on the left. She looked asleep, head tilted back against the leather headrest, eyes closed. Right hand resting on a stack of papers fanned across the desk in overlapping layers, each tabbed with yellow flags along the margins. Her breathing was even, her face was still. There was nothing theatrical about it. No one performing sleep looks like that. Sleep looks like surrender, and this woman looked like she had surrendered to something enormous and was resting inside it rather than against it. James pulled the cart in slowly. He had a system for offices where people fell asleep at their desks. It happened 3 or 4 times a year on the executive floor. usually before a board meeting or during a quarter that wasn't going well. You worked around them. No vacuum, no spray bottles on the glass. You moved carefully, took the trash, restocked the soap if it was out, and left without waking anyone, because waking them was not the job. The job was to be invisible. He was good at that. He moved to the far side of the desk, reached for the trash can tucked underneath, and that was when he saw the monitor, not a screensaver, not a spreadsheet left open. A live dashboard, data scrolling in real time down 3 columns, the kind of display you configure when you need to watch something active, when you need to see a system in motion rather than at rest. He did not mean to read it. The monitor was angled directly toward the door, and the data on it was the kind of data that a man with 13 years in systems administration does not just glance at and set aside. It reaches into the part of your brain you thought you had put away in a locked room in a building you no longer visited, and it pulls access ace logs, doors and rows. Login entries, file transfer records, session timestamps. The format was standard, the kind of interface James had spent years reading across half a dozen different platforms, and the pattern. In it was visible the way a structural crack is visible. You do not need to be an engineer to see that something is wrong. But if you are an engineer, you see exactly what is wrong and exactly why it matters. He went still. The trash can was in his hand. Bulk file downloads, multiple entries, times clustered between 1 and 4 in the morning across 11 weeks. Not a single entry during business hours. Not one. The files themselves were flagged with classification markers he recognized from federal contract documentation, the kind of markers that mean the contents are proprietary, protected, not the kind of thing you email yourself by mistake. Every single download was logged under the same account, R. Sanchez Scu. James set the trash can down with the care of a man whose hands need to be empty so his brain can work. Ronald Sanchez, Chief Operating Officer. The other face on the lobby screen, the one on the right. James had never spoken to him. He had seen him in the building maybe a dozen times across 3.5 years, always in motion, always surrounded by people with lanyards and laptops, always moving through the lobby or the elevator bank with the energy of someone who understood that being seen moving quickly was its own kind of signal. The man's name was on a plaque in the lobby beside hers. Leadership you can trust. James looked at the name on the monitor. Then he looked at the woman in the chair. Then he looked at the stack of papers under her hand, and even from 6 feet away the words on the top page were large enough to read without moving closer. Chapter 11. Crestline Systems. In the matter of, he took one breath, the rational thing, the safe thing, the thing that every instinct he had built across 3.5 years of keeping his head down, and his opinions to himself was telling him to do, was to take the trash and go. He was a janitor. This was not his flaw in any way that mattered. This was the flaw of people with corner offices and stock options, people whose problems got resolved by other people with corner offices and stock options. Not by the man with the mop. He was not supposed to understand what he was looking at, except he did. He understood it exactly. And standing there in the pale blue light of that monitor, James Smith felt something shift in his chest that had not shifted in a very long time. Not excitement, not quite fear, something older and more specific, the feeling of recognition, the feeling of a man who has spent years looking at broken systems, and is now, in this moment, looking at one again, and finding that the part of him that knows how to read them never actually went quiet. It was just waiting for a system worth reading. He reached into his back pocket and took out his phone. His hands did not shake. He opened the camera, held the phone steady toward the monitor, and began photographing the access logs. Entry by entry, timestamp by timestamp, file name by file name. He moved methodically, the way he had moved through thousands of audits in a different life, covering the full display, making sure every row was legible, every account name sharp, every classification marker visible. 23 photographs. He checked each one, zoomed in, checked again. Then he put the phone back in his pocket, picked up the trash can, emptied it into the bag on his cart, replaced the liner, set it back in its spot under the desk, and pushed the cart out of the corner office without making a sound. The hallway was empty. The overhead lights hummed in their flat institutional way, the sound of a building that did not know and did not care what had just happened inside it. James walked to the service elevator, pressed the button, and stood there watching the floor indicator count down from 12. His face showed nothing. His mind was doing something it had not done in 3 years. It was running. Here is the thing about systems. Every system has a logic, a set of rules it follows, whether those rules were written down by someone or whether they grew over time from 1,000 small decisions made by people who had long since moved on. You learn a system the way you learn a language, slowly at first, then all at once, and then you can hear it even when other people cannot. The way a musician hears a wrong note in a room full of people who just hear music. James had spent 13 years learning the language of data infrastructure. He started as a junior technician at a mid-sized firm in Arlington, Virginia, in his early 30s after a decade of piecing together IT certifications between shifts at a hardware store and 6 months as a network support tech for a property management company in Indianapolis. Not a straight line. Not the kind of resume that made hiring managers lean forward. But the skills were real, the work was real, and by the time he was 40, he was running penetration tests for clients whose names he was contractually prohibited from mentioning in any other context. He was good at it. Genuinely, measurably, provably good. And then his marriage ended. Not with a scene. Not with an accusation or a single moment he could point to later and say, "There, that was the thing that broke it." It ended the way a slow leak ends a drive. You keep going and keep going. And one day you realize you have been riding on the rim for so long the metal itself is worn through. Laura had not left him for someone else. She had left him for a version of her own life that included more than a husband who was technically present and emotionally somewhere down a server rack. A man who came home from work and opened his laptop because something had occurred to him. Who nodded through dinner while his brain was 3 problems deep in a client's network architecture. Who was a decent man in the abstract and an absent one in practice, and who had used up her patience so gradually that neither of them noticed it was gone until it was. She had been patient about it for a long time. Then she had been honest. Then she was gone. Emma was 9. Brown hair, her mother's eyes, already reading chapter books above her grade, and firmly committed to the position that most adults were working from incomplete information. The custody arrangement gave James every other weekend and 1 evening a week. He drove back from the courthouse that day, pulled into the parking lot of a Wendy's on I-95, and sat there for 45 minutes without getting out of the car. He applied for 7 positions over the next 4 months. None called back. Not because his skills had degraded, they had not. Not because the references were bad, they were fine. A job interview requires a man to walk into a room and sell himself, and James could not sell himself because he had stopped believing he had anything worth buying. He sent the emails. He tailored the resumes. He sat across from hiring managers in conference rooms, and when they asked where he saw himself in 5 years, something in him went very quiet and stayed there. He took the night shift at Crestline Systems, because a staffing agency called on a Thursday afternoon and the position started Monday and he needed income, and he said yes before he finished reading the description. Maintenance Technician 2. He had held the paper with that title in his kitchen, 1 bedroom, Pilsen, 3rd floor, radiator that knocked twice every time it cycled on, and thought, this is what comes next. And what came next was fine. It was not what he had been. It was not what he had wanted. But fine was something people underestimated when they had never lost enough to understand what fine actually costs to maintain. 3 years and 7 months of fine. Until tonight. The service elevator opened into the basement maintenance area, a long room with concrete floors and wire shelving, and the industrial smell of cleaning products that James had stopped registering after the first 6 months. He parked his cart along the wall, sat down on the metal bench beside the supply shelves, and looked at the photographs on his phone. He looked at them the way he used to look at anomaly reports, not skimming, reading. The timestamps were the first confirmation that none of it was accidental. Accidental bulk downloads cluster around business hours because that is when people are in systems, making mistakes, pulling things they did not mean to pull. These downloads clustered between 1 and 4 in the morning because whoever was running them knew exactly when the building emptied. They knew the overnight security rotation. They knew when the cleaning crews were on which floors, or they simply did not care who noticed, because they had decided no one who could understand it would be awake. The system had not pushed back. Not once. 214 downloads. By his count from the photograph, some entries clipped at the scroll boundary, so the real number was likely higher. classified files, defense contract submissions, pricing models, client vulnerability assessments, the kind of documentation a competitor would need to underbid a company on exactly the kind of contracts that Crestline had apparently been losing for over a year. James sat with that for a moment. Then he opened his contacts and found a name he had not called in 4 years and 2 months, Gary Young. Gary had been a senior analyst at the same Virginia firm 4 years ahead of James in tenure, roughly 12 years ahead of him in the specific discipline of reading a breach investigation the way a radiologist reads a film. Gary had moved to a private digital forensics practice in Dallas after the firm was acquired, and they had exchanged maybe 6 texts since, the kind that say nothing much except that the line between them had not completely gone dead. James pressed call 2:37 in the morning. Gary answered on the 4th ring. His voice had that mid-cycle interrupted quality, thick, slightly delayed, not angry but not fully there yet. James did not explain the context. Did not say I am a janitor now, or I have spent 3 years doing a slow disappearing act that I am only now starting to understand the cost of. He said he had photographs of access logs showing a pattern he needed a second opinion on, that he could not explain where they came from, and that he needed to know if the pattern was real or if he was seeing something that wasn't there. Send them. James forwarded the 23 photographs and sat on the bench and counted ceiling tiles. There were 31 of them. He had gotten to 22 and started over twice by the time the phone rang again. 19 minutes. Gary's voice was different now. The sleep was gone. Something precise had replaced it, the register of a man who has just looked at something that requires care and is choosing his words accordingly. What Gary told him took about 4 minutes. The pattern was real. Textbook exfiltration methodology. The timing, the file selection, the volume, the use of a high-clearance internal account to stay under automated flag thresholds. None of it was accidental. None of it was a system glitch. And none of it was the kind of thing a compliance team typically catches unless they are specifically looking for it. Someone had built this deliberately, with an understanding of exactly which files had competitive value and exactly when the building would be empty enough to move them without triggering anything. Then Gary said the thing James had already been assembling in the back of his mind. Federal jurisdiction, theft of trade secrets at this scale with defense contract documentation in the mix, fell under federal statute. FBI territory, not HR, not the compliance hotline. Be careful, Gary said. His voice had gone flat in the way voices go flat when the stakes are real. Be very careful about what you do with what you're holding. The line went quiet. James sat in the basement of Crestline Systems at 2:49 in the morning and looked at his phone. He was a janitor. He had photographed a CEO's security dashboard without authorization. Depending on how an attorney chose to read his employment agreement and Crestline's data confidentiality protocols, what he had done in that office could be framed as a breach. Not a malicious one, not even a careless one, but a breach. He had crossed a line that his role, his clearance level, and his signed paperwork all said he should not cross, and the photographs were evidence of it. If he brought this forward, and Ronald Sanchez's legal team moved fast enough or persuasively enough, James would not be seen as a witness. He would be seen as a trespasser, a former tech professional turned janitor who had overreached, violated his agreement, and inserted himself into matters far above his pay grade. He could lose the job. He could face civil litigation. He could lose the apartment, the routine, the small, careful life he had spent 3 years building piece by piece from what was left after the one before it came apart. And upstairs, on 51 pages, sitting under a sleeping woman's hand, there was a document scheduled for signature at 9 o'clock in the morning. He opened the browser on his phone. Searched for the FBI field office in Chicago. Did not go to the tip portal. The tip portal was anonymous, and anonymous was not going to get anyone to the 48th floor of Crestline Systems before 9 a.m. on a Friday. He found the main contact line and wrote the number on the back of a maintenance request slip from his shirt pocket. Then he put the phone down and sat there with the slip of paper in his hand. The decision was not complicated. That was the thing he kept coming back to. People make decisions sound complicated when what they really mean is that the decision is costly. The decision itself was not complicated. He had seen something wrong. He understood exactly what it was. He had the skills to document it, and he had documented it. The only question was whether he was willing to pay what acting on it would cost. He thought about the woman in the chair, not as a CEO, not as a billion-dollar company or a board of directors or a face on a lobby screen. He thought about the way her hand was resting on those papers, the way she was sitting alone in the dark at 2 a.m, in a building that was about to stop belonging to her, not knowing that the reason it was gone had nothing to do with the market or a competitor's innovation or any failure of her own. Someone she had trusted for 16 years had been selling her out in the middle of the night, and she was about to sign the document that would make it permanent. James stood up. He was not going to call the FBI at 3 a.m. But he was not going to do nothing, either, because doing nothing was its own decision, and he had spent 3 years making that particular choice by default. He was not in the business of making it deliberately. He went back upstairs and finished his shift, vacuumed the hallway, wiped the glass walls of the conference rooms, restocked the hand soap in 4 of 6 restrooms. He moved through the 48th floor with the same economy he brought to every shift, doing it all with 23 photographs on his phone and a number on a slip of paper in his shirt pocket. He did not go back to the corner office. He did not need to. The service elevator took him down at 6:15, and the morning crew was already filtering into the lobby with their coffees and lanyards and the forward-leaning energy of people with somewhere to be. James went out through the loading dock entrance and turned left on Wabash, the corner diner. Black coffee, scrambled eggs. He sat at the counter and did not look at his phone. Chicago was waking up the way it does in early November, gray and purposeful, the lake wind pushing cold down the grid streets with the authority of something that has been doing this for a very long time, and sees no reason to stop. Cabs and delivery trucks. A woman in a red coat walking a large dog that had strong opinions about which direction they should be going. 2 construction workers at the far end of the counter talking about a game from 2 nights ago. Normal. Completely normal. The way everything sometimes is when something enormous is sitting in your chest and the world around you has no idea. He drank the coffee and thought about Emma. She would be at the kitchen table in Richmond by now, bowl of cereal, a book open beside it the way she had been every morning since she was 6. She did not need to be told to read. She just read. His ex-wife had sent him a photo of it once, not long after the divorce, not cruelly, but because Emma, reading at breakfast, was the kind of thing you wanted to share, even when sharing anything was complicated, and James had kept it in his phone's favorites folder for 2 years without mentioning it to anyone. He thought about the last call they had. She had asked him what he did at work, and he had said he worked in a big building. She had accepted that the way children accept things they sense are not the whole story, not with satisfaction, but with the patience of someone who has learned that some questions come back around eventually, and pushing them early changes nothing. She was 12 now. Old enough to know the answer she had been given was incomplete. Old enough to stop asking. He left a 10 on the counter. He walked back to his apartment in Pilsen, up 3 flights, let himself in, and sat at the kitchen table with his phone and the maintenance slip and the number on the back of it. He needed to know the rules before he picked up the phone. He opened his browser, searched whistleblower protection attorney Chicago, Illinois. Read 3 websites. 2 were too general. The third was specific enough to give him what he needed. The Defend Trade Secrets Act and related federal statutes offered explicit protection to individuals who reported suspected theft of trade secrets to federal authorities, provided the report was made through proper channels and with a real name attached, provided it was done correctly. He called the number on that third website at 6:50 in the morning, expecting voicemail, and got a live human, a woman named Carol, whose voice had the quality of someone who had handled early calls before and did not consider them unusual. He described the situation in broad terms. 4 minutes, she said. You observed it in a space where you were authorized to be. You did not access the system. You photographed what was visible from where you stood. That distinction is legally meaningful. If you report to federal authorities with your real name, in writing, with photographs as documentation, you are almost certainly covered under whistleblower protections. A pause. Almost certainly, he thanked her and hung up and looked at the clock on the microwave, 7:09 a.m. He picked up his phone, found the FBI Chicago field office number, not the tip portal, the direct line, and dialed 2 rings. FBI Chicago. This is Agent Marsh, James said. My name is James Smith. I work nights at Crestline Systems in the Loop. I have 23 photographs of an access log showing classified data exfiltration by the company's COO over at least 11 weeks. There's a board meeting at 9 this morning, where the CEO is scheduled to sign bankruptcy documents. I believe the bankruptcy is a direct result of the breach. I need to know if anything can be done before 9. Silence. Not surprise. The silence of someone writing, sir. I need you to email those photographs to me right now. I'll give you a direct address. Do not go anywhere. James wrote down the address. He sent the photographs. He sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the grey November sky and the fire escape on the building across the alley, where a dead plant in a terracotta pot had been sitting for what looked like several weeks, brown and dry, waiting for someone to notice. 7:51 a.m. He did not know if the photographs would land on a desk with context or without it. Did not know if Agent Marsh would take them up the chain or sit on them until Monday. Did not know if 23 photographs taken by a man who cleaned floors were going to matter to anyone with the authority to act on them. But he had done the thing he could do. The rest was out of his hands. He made a second cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the city do its ordinary Friday morning things below him. Somewhere on the 48th floor of a building in the Loop, a woman was probably already in the elevator, already beginning the hour that would end with her pen on the page that would unmake everything she had spent 23 years building, and she did not know. She did not know someone had stood in her office at 2:30 in the morning and made a choice that went against every calculation of self-interest available to him. She did not know the janitor had seen it. She did not know the janitor had understood it. She did not know that the man who had made an art of disappearing for 3.5 years had pulled out his phone in the dark, taken 23 photographs, called a forensics analyst in Dallas and a whistleblower attorney in Chicago, and was now standing in a one-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, watching a dead plant on a fire escape, waiting to find out if it had been enough. James put the cup in the sink. He went and sat in the chair by the window. 7:58. He thought, I used to be someone who understood these systems. He thought, I never stopped understanding them. He thought, I just stopped believing that still counted for anything. And then he stopped thinking and sat there in the November light of a city that did not know his name, waiting. Behind the closed door of the corner office on the 48th floor, Sandra Anderson opened her eyes. The room was empty. The cleaning cart was gone. A faint trace of disinfectant lingered near the door, barely there, the kind of thing you only catch if you are already still and paying attention to what the air tells you. She sat up slowly in the chair. She had not been asleep. She had not been asleep since well before midnight, and she was not going to pretend, even alone in this room, that she had managed it. What she had done was stay very still and keep her breathing even, and wait to see what the building and the people in it would show her when they believed no one was watching. The monitor was still running, the dashboard still scrolled. She looked at the clock. 3:15 a.m. She leaned forward and began to read. She had looked at the dashboard before glanced at it, understood what she was looking at in the broad sense, felt the weight of the suspicion she had been carrying for weeks begin to take a more definite shape. But she had not read it the way you read something, when you are prepared to accept whatever it says. She had been waiting for something to confirm that reading it carefully was worth doing. She had heard the click of a phone camera in a dark room. That was enough. She read for nearly an hour, line by line. Cross-referencing download timestamps against the dates, Crestline had lost each of its 4 major contracts over the past 14 months. The dates she had memorized the way you memorize dates that feel like wounds, because that is what they were. Every time Harlow Defense Group had come in under Crestline's margin, with a precision that defied ordinary competition, a bulk download from Ronald's account had preceded it by 3 to 7 days. Not luck, not a competitor who happened to be better. A blueprint handed over in the middle of the night. She thought about the first time she had trusted Ronald with something significant. Second year of Crestline, when she had been out for 8 days with pneumonia bad enough that her doctor had used the word severe and her body had used the word please. Ronald had run the company in her absence, handled a client escalation, negotiated a contract extension, sent her a morning summary email each day so precise and so useful that she had read them between fevers and thought, not for the first time, I made the right hire. She had thought that many times over 16 years. She had been right about his competence. She had been catastrophically wrong about what he intended to do with it. She did not cry. She sat in the chair in the dark office and let the weight of it settle into her the way cold settles into a building when the heat goes off slowly, room by room, until the whole structure is the same temperature as whatever is outside. She did not slam anything or call anyone. She did not pick up the phone and wake up her attorneys. She straightened the yellow tabs on the signature page of the bankruptcy filing. And then she set it on the far corner of the desk and watched the dashboard scroll. She did not know who had been in this room tonight. Did not know what they had done after leaving. Did not know if what she had heard, that single soft click, the careful footsteps retreating, the elevator chime at the end of the hall had produced anything or would produce anything by 9 o'clock this morning. But she knew one thing with the particular certainty of a person who has spent 23 years reading situations for the variable that doesn't fit. Whoever had stood in this room at 2:30 in the morning had seen what she saw and had not walked away from it. In a building full of people with every professional incentive to notice what mattered and every personal incentive to look past it, someone with no standing, no clearance and nothing to gain had stayed. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, the first thing in 14 months that felt like something other than the ground continuing to give way beneath her. Sandra Anderson sat in her dark office in the early hours of a Friday morning in November and waited for whatever came next. 7:48 a.m. Ronald Sanchez walked through the lobby of Crestline Systems, carrying 2 cups of coffee like a man who had already won, which was the thing about him. The thing Sandra Anderson had spent 16 years quietly cataloguing as a professional asset and was now, in the full light of a Friday morning, reading as something else entirely. Ronald did not enter rooms. He arrived in them. The charcoal suit, not the navy one he wore on Mondays, the charcoal one he reserved for days when something significant was happening, and he wanted his presence to communicate that he understood the significance. Shoes polished not recently, but that morning specifically, because he had known what kind of day this was going to be, and he had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, which was thoroughly and without visible effort. Sandra watched him from the corridor outside her office. He had not seen her yet. She watched him greet the security desk associate by name. Watched him check his phone once without breaking stride. Watched him step into the elevator with the unhurried ease of a man who had already done all the difficult parts and was now simply waiting for the paperwork to arrive at the same conclusion he had. She had known Ronald Sanchez for 16 years. She had hired him when Crestline was 18 months old and still operating out of a converted loft in Wicker Park, with 7 employees and a coffee machine that required a specific sequence of button presses that only 3 people had fully mastered. He had come recommended by a former colleague, mid-30s, sharp in meetings, sharper in the follow-up emails he sent afterward that turned every discussion into a clear list of actions before anyone else had finished the drive home. She had given him a title that was larger than the company warranted at the time, because she believed in what Crestline was going to become and she wanted him inside that belief with her. He had, apparently, believed in it enough to sell it, piece by piece, file by file, between 1 and 4 in the morning, when the building was empty and no one was watching, except someone had been watching, just not the person Ronald would have predicted. Sandra walked back to her office, sat at her desk, and looked at the monitor still running the security dashboard. She had spent the hours between 3 and 6:30 reading every entry, cross-referencing timestamps against contract loss dates, mapping the pattern the way she used to map network vulnerabilities in Crestline's early years, when she was still writing her own security architecture and had not yet learned to trust other people to write it for her. The correlation was not approximate, it was exact. Every time Harlow Defense Group had submitted a bid that landed inside Crestline's margin with surgical precision, a bulk download from Ronald's account had preceded it by 3 to 7 days. Deliberate, patient, methodical. She picked up the coffee cup he had set on her desk, still warm. There was a cardboard sleeve on it from the shop 2 blocks south that he stopped at on days he brought her coffee not every day, only on days when he wanted her to feel he had been thinking of her before he arrived. She understood now that this was a technique, the same way his handshake was a technique, and his memory for personal details was a technique, and the way he tilted his head slightly when she was speaking, that particular angle that made her feel for 16 years like she was the most important voice in the room. She drank the coffee anyway, because she was cold, because it was good coffee, because putting it down would have told him something she was not ready for him to know. Long night, his voice from the doorway warm, calibrated, the spoken equivalent of the cardboard sleeve. Sandra looked up. The long ones always end. He came in and settled into the chair across from her desk, the chair he had occupied 10,000 times, and opened his notepad to a page of talking points organized under headings she recognized from the bankruptcy timeline documentation their attorneys had sent over Wednesday afternoon. He had prepared. Of course he had. Ronald Sanchez always prepared. It had once been among the qualities she most relied on. He walked her through the board meeting sequence. Kenneth Lee's opening statement. The motion to proceed with Chapter 11. The vote. The signing. The employee communication plan already drafted and sitting in the HR director's outbox, set to send at 9:15. He spoke with the measured authority of a surgeon explaining a procedure. Here is what happens. Here is the sequence. Here is where you need to be. She listened. The listening felt like watching a clock from the wrong side of the glass. Seeing the hands move. Hearing none of the ticking. He was very good. That was what settled into her chest like cold water and stayed there. Not the betrayal itself. Betrayals, she had learned across 23 years in business, were a kind of weather. They came. You did not always see them and could not always prevent them, and dealt with them when they arrived. What stayed was the quality of it, the craft, the patience, the fact that for 16 years she had sat across this desk from a man who was performing loyalty, the way an actor performs grief, with enough truth threaded through it that the performance held, and she had never once seen where the seams were. That said something about him. It also said something about her. She was not yet sure exactly what, but she was going to have time to work it out. Her phone vibrated on the desk surface. A text from Derek, her IT director, 26 years old and radiating the specific unease of someone who has found something they are not sure they were meant to find. System flagged unusual access patterns from last week. Putting together a report. Who should I send it to? Sandra typed back without lifting her eyes toward Ronald. Set it to me. No one else. Derek's response came in 4 seconds, which told her he had been sitting with that message ready to send and waiting for direction. Got it. Sending now. She placed the phone face down on the desk. Ronald had moved on to the asset liquidation timeline. Which server clusters were slated for auction? Which client contracts had transfer provisions? His voice had the rhythm of someone completely comfortable with their own expertise, and she let it fill the office the way white noise fills a room present, constant, not absorbing. She was thinking about a service elevator chiming at the end of a dark hallway. She was thinking about 23 photographs on a phone belonging to someone she had never spoken to. She was thinking about the stack of papers still on her desk with the yellow tab on page 51, and the fact that her pen had not yet touched it. The board members arrived between 8:15 and 8:40 in the order they always arrived, which Sandra had mapped across years of meetings without consciously intending to. Kenneth Lee first, always, because Kenneth believed that arriving first to any meeting was itself a form of authority. Then the two from the finance committee, then the independent directors. Then the ones who had flown in from the coasts and arrived carrying the slightly breathless energy of people who had been in airports before dawn. Even when their flights had landed the previous evening, they filed into the glass-walled conference room on the north side of the floor. Sandra stood at the window of her office and watched them settle. 9 people. She had worked with most of them for more than a decade. She knew their professional histories, their communication preferences, which ones needed data before they could commit to a position, and which ones needed a story. She knew which ones genuinely cared about Crestline as something they had helped build, and which ones carried it as a line item in a portfolio they reviewed quarterly. What she knew now, and had not known before last night, was that none of them had seen it coming either. That was not comfort, but it was a fact, and facts in her experience were more useful than comfort in situations where comfort was the thing most likely to make you soft. She picked up the bankruptcy filing from her desk, 51 pages. The yellow tabs on the signature page were slightly skewed from where her hand had rested on them through the night, and she straightened them now out of the same reflex that made her align the edges of documents before any meeting, and replace the cap on a pen before setting it down. Small orderings. The things you do when the large things have temporarily moved outside your control. She walked to the conference room. The room quieted when she entered the way. Rooms had quieted when she entered them for 20 years, and she took her seat at the head of the table and set the filing in front of her and looked at the 9 faces arranged along both sides. Ronald sat 2 chairs to her left, notepad open, the Parker pen with the gold clip that she had noticed. He rotated slowly between his fingers during high-stakes meetings, a tell she had clocked years ago and never mentioned. He was not rotating it now. He held it completely still, which meant he was either very calm or working very hard at the appearance of calm, and she had lost the ability to distinguish between the two where he was concerned. Kenneth Lee opened the session with the language of performed solemnity. He spoke about Crestline's legacy, about the difficulty of the present moment, about the responsibility of leadership to protect stakeholder value and move forward with clarity and decisiveness. Every sentence arrived with the soft certainty of language that had been drafted and revised and rehearsed, because Kenneth Lee did not say anything in a board meeting that he had not already said to himself in preparation. He asked if there were any questions before proceeding to the vote. Silence. Not the silence of people wrestling with a decision. The silence of people who had already arrived at the decision separately and were waiting for the room to catch up. Sandra looked at the filing, page 51. Yellow tab. She thought about what it had taken to build this company, not as biography, not as the version she gave in interviews, but granularly, specifically, the actual texture of it. The 18-hour days in the Wicker Park loft with the coffee machine that required its ritual. The first enterprise client pitch she'd given with a fever of 102 because she could not reschedule and could not afford to appear as someone who would reschedule. The 3 weeks she had slept on the office couch during the federal compliance certification process because going home felt like leaving something unguarded. She thought about the defense contract, 18 months of preparation, a technical submission that represented the most sophisticated work Crestline's engineering team had ever produced, a document she had reviewed word by word, diagram by diagram, cost line by cost line. The work had been genuinely good, demonstrably, objectively good. And Harlow Defense Group had won the contract with a submission that Crestline's attorneys, reviewing the publicly available portions afterward, had described as remarkably aligned with Crestline's documented methodology. Remarkably aligned, because Ronald Sanchez had sat in this building between 1 and 4 in the morning for 11 weeks and transferred it to them. She picked up her pen. She was aware of the room with the hyper-presence that high-pressure situations produced in her every detail, slightly sharpened. The morning light through the glass wall crossing the conference table in a long diagonal stripe. Kenneth Lee's left hand flat on the surface. Ronald's pen perfectly, deliberately still. She moved her pen toward the page. The tip touched the signature line. The contact was real and physical, the specific texture of a legal document under a pen point, the slight give of the paper, and the door opened. She came in without knocking. Which was not itself remarkable. People entered glass-walled conference rooms without knocking when the meeting inside was visible, and knocking would have been theater. But she came in with 2 men behind her, and the 3 of them were wearing identical dark suits that did not belong to Crestline's legal team, and the woman in front held up a badge with the precise economy of someone who has performed this motion many times and has stopped thinking about it. Special Agent Sharon Ramirez, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Chicago Field Office. The room did not make a sound, not the managed silence of corporate meetings where people wait politely for the next agenda item. The other kind, the kind that follows a detonation, when the shock wave has passed through and the air has not yet decided what to do with itself. Agent Ramirez did not look at Sandra. She looked at Ronald Sanchez. Her voice was level and moved through the glass-walled room with the authority of someone who has learned that volume is the least efficient tool available. She identified herself and her colleagues. She stated they were present to execute a federal search warrant on the digital accounts, company-issued devices, and office of Ronald Sanchez, Chief Operating Officer of Crestline Systems, in connection with an active federal investigation into corporate espionage and theft of trade secrets under 18 U.S.C. Section 1832. Kenneth Lee stood up. His chair made a sound against the floor that was far louder than it should have been in a room that quiet. On what authority? His voice had the register of a man accustomed to his objections carrying weight. Agent Ramirez turned to him without losing her momentum and placed a copy of the warrant on the table in front of him. Not dismissively, with the precision of someone handing over a document when the document is the complete answer to the question being asked. Then she looked back at Ronald, Mr. Sanchez. Please step out with us. The room held. Sandra did not move. She was watching Ronald's face, and she was watching it with the attention of someone who had spent 16 years reading that face, across conference tables and dinner tables and press conference podiums and emergency calls at 11 at night, who had thought she knew every register it had. She had expected calculation. She had expected the expression of a man running contingencies. She got something different. For approximately 4 seconds, Ronald Sanchez looked at the warrant copy in Kenneth Lee's hands, and his face did the thing that faces do when the processing is moving faster than the expression can update. Not blank, not panicked. The face of a man running numbers in a room where the numbers have stopped producing the results he built his calculations around. Then he looked at Sandra, and the calculation left his face entirely. What replaced it was something she had not anticipated and did not have a clean category for. Not contempt, not defeat exactly. Something adjacent to both: the expression of a man who had decided the odds were acceptable and has just received the definitive information that he was wrong about the odds, and who wants the person across the table to know that he understands precisely how this looks and precisely where it went wrong. She held his gaze and said nothing, because there was nothing she needed to say. He had already said everything in 11 weeks of downloads between 1 and 4 in the morning, in 16 years of calibrated warmth and rehearsed loyalty, in every coffee brought up from the shop 2 blocks south on the days he needed her to feel that she was being considered. He had said all of it. Without a word, Ronald Sanchez stood up slowly. He buttoned the jacket of the charcoal suit with steady hands, reached for the Parker pen on the notepad. Agent Ramirez, Mr. Sanchez, leave the device on the table. He set the pen down. He did not look at Kenneth Lee, did not look at the warrant copy, did not look at the bankruptcy filing still open on the table with the yellow tab on page 51 and the signature line clean and unsigned. He walked out of the conference room, and the 2 agents followed, and the door closed behind them, and the silence that came after was the heaviest thing in the room. Kenneth Lee sat back down. He did it the way people sit when their legs make the decision before the brain has fully processed why. He set the warrant copy on the table and looked at it for a long moment before he looked at Sandra. Did you know this was going to happen? The question was not an accusation. It was the question of a man who needed to understand the shape of what he had just been inside. Sandra met his eyes. I knew something was wrong. I did not know federal agents were walking through that door this morning. She paused. Both of those things are true. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone absorbing rather than agreeing. The rest of the board had the collective posture of people who had prepared carefully for a meeting that no longer existed and were recalibrating in real time. Questions were forming. She could see them in the way people were exchanging glances, in the way the 2 finance committee members had already shifted slightly toward each other in the manner that meant they needed to confer privately before this went any further. Sandra stood up. We are not signing anything today. She said it without drama because the drama had walked out of the room in a charcoal suit, and there was no point staging it for the aftermath. Go home. I'll call a full session Monday morning with complete information. Kenneth Lee looked at the bankruptcy filing still open on the table, the yellow tab pristine, the signature line untouched. Sandra. His voice had something in it she had not heard from him in at least 2 years. Something that had shed the practiced gravity of chairmanship and was quieter without it, and more direct. What are we dealing with here? We are dealing with the truth, she said. We should have been dealing with it 14 months ago. We will catch up, She picked up the filing, closed the cover, and walked out of the conference room. She sat alone in her office for 40 minutes. The phone was ringing, and she had forwarded it to voicemail. Email was accumulating in the inbox visible on her secondary monitor: attorneys, communications team, HR director, 2 board members, who had apparently gone directly from the conference room to their phones in the elevator. The full apparatus of a company in crisis doing what it does, which is generate communication at an accelerating rate proportional to how much nobody knows what to say. She was not looking at any of it. She was looking at the monitor, still running the security dashboard, which she had no intention of turning off until the federal forensics team asked her to preserve it as evidence. 214 downloads, 91 days, 16 years. The competence had never been in question. That was the part she kept circling. Ronald had not needed to do this. His compensation at Crestline was substantial, his position secure, his future at the company never in doubt as far as she had known, which meant this was not about security. It was not about grievance or ideology or any accumulated wrong she had failed to see. Money has a particular clarity in corporate betrayal. It is cleaner than ideology and more legible than resentment. It does not require years of slow accumulation. It only requires one moment when someone presents a number large enough to reframe what you thought you already had. She looked at the chair he had vacated. 16 years. She did not cry. She had not cried in a professional context since the first year of the company, when a client terminated without warning, and she had held it together through the call, and for 11 minutes afterward, before sitting on the bathroom floor of the Wicker Park loft and allowing herself exactly that 11 minutes, and then standing up and calling the next name on the prospect list. She was not going to cry now either. What she felt was not grief. It was closer to the sensation of a measuring instrument that has been reading slightly wrong for a very long time being corrected back to true. The adjustment, both necessary and disorienting, and, under all of a relief that the instrument was still capable of being corrected at all. Her phone rang. A 312 area code, Chicago. She answered it because the day had already contained enough surprises that one more seemed manageable. Agent Sharon Ramirez. Her voice was the same as it had been, in the conference room level, precise, carrying within it the specific gravity of someone who works in facts and has learned to deliver them without inflection. She told Sandra that the evidence James Smith had provided that morning was consistent with an active FBI investigation that had been running for 6 weeks into Harlow Defense Group's federal contracting practices. She said that the photograph, combined with the forensic access logs the team was now pulling from Crestline's servers under the warrant, provided sufficient predicate to hold Ronald Sanchez and advance the investigation. She confirmed that James Smith had been identified as a protected whistleblower under applicable federal statute, that his cooperation was voluntary, specific, and that without the timing of his report that morning, the intervention would not have been possible before the board meeting. Then she said, "The man who called us this morning is one of your maintenance staff. I thought you should know that." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. She did not know, not for certain, not his name or anything, beyond what the sounds in a dark office at 2:30 in the morning had told her. But she had known since the moment she opened her eyes and smelled the disinfectant near the door that the person who had been in her office had seen everything on that monitor and had not simply walked away from it. She had known. She just had not known his name until now. James Smith was asleep in Pilsen, not deeply. The kind of sleep a body claims when it has reached the point where it will accept whatever is available: a ceiling, a mattress, the absence of anything requiring a response. He had sat at the kitchen window until nearly 9, watching the clock on his phone tick past each 5-minute mark, with the focused attention of someone who cannot do anything to affect the outcome and cannot stop trying to. Anyway, at 8:58 he had set a timer, taken his shoes off but left his clothes on, and lain down on the bed because lying down fully dressed was rest, not sleep, and right now rest was what his body would accept. The phone woke him at 11:47. He answered without sitting up. Agent Marsh. 40 seconds of information delivered in the careful register of someone experienced at translating an active federal situation into language a civilian can absorb without requiring further management. Ronald Sanchez was in custody. The warrant had been executed, The board meeting had not produced the bankruptcy filing. It had been assembled to sign. And James Smith's identity was protected under the Defend Trade Secrets Act as a reporting individual. Crestline Systems, its legal representatives, its board and its employees were legally prohibited from taking any adverse action against him in connection with his report. James stared at the ceiling. The radiator knocked twice. He said, "Okay," which was not an adequate response to any of it, but was the only word that fit through the opening his brain had available at 11:47 in the morning after no sleep and 4 hours of waiting, and the low continuous pressure of having done something that could not be undone and not knowing what it had produced. Now he knew. He set the phone on his chest and looked at the ceiling and thought, okay, the word was carrying a significant amount of weight. It was holding things he did not yet have language for, the specific sensation of having understood something and acted on that understanding, which was different from everything else he had done in 3 years in the way that being awake is different from dreaming. Not necessarily better in every dimension, but real in a way that left a mark. The kind of mark that does not fade because it is not a bruise. It is a record. He sat up. His shoes were beside the bed. He put them on, went to the kitchen, and made a third cup of coffee standing at the window this time, not sitting, watching the street below where a city bus had stopped at the corner to let 2 people off and take 3 on before pulling away with the complete indifference of a machine that has somewhere to be. He thought about what Gary had said. Be careful. Be very careful about what you do with what you're holding. He had been careful. He had also been something else. Something that did not have a clean professional name. Something that had surfaced when a man who had spent 3 years carefully not caring about anything had looked at a situation and found that caring was not actually optional. That it had persisted through all the careful not caring, the way his ability to read those logs had persisted through everything, not gone, not degraded, just dormant, waiting for a system worth reading. You cannot unlearn 13 years. You can choose not to apply them, but the knowledge does not leave. It waits for the moment when the situation is specific enough to call it back, and then it is simply there, the way it was always there, and the only question is whether the man carrying it will answer. He drank the coffee. He thought about Sandra Anderson on the 48th floor, what this morning had been for her, what it meant to have the thing you were certain was ending turn out to be something else entirely. He did not know her, had never spoken to her, had watched her sleep in a dark office with her hand resting on a document that was supposed to unmake 23 years, and had taken 23 photographs and made 3 phone calls and put his shoes on that morning, knowing one of 2 things was going to happen, only one of which involved him still having a job by noon. He still had a job, technically. He rinsed the cup and put it in the rack. He went and sat in the chair by the window, the same chair, the same window, the same view of the street and the building across the alley with the dead plant on the fire escape that was still there, still brown, still waiting for someone to do something about it. 2:07 in the morning felt like it had happened to a different version of him. It was not even noon on the same day. He looked at the plant for a while. Then he picked up his phone and scrolled to Gary's number. Gary answered on the second ring. Fully awake. Waiting maybe, James said. It worked. A pause. Then Gary. Yeah, another pause. I saw the news alert 20 minutes ago. Crestline COO. He stopped. You doing okay? James looked out the window. I think so. Good. Gary's voice had something in it that was not quite sentiment but was adjacent to it, the tone of a man who has spent a career in evidence and facts and is allowing himself, briefly, one thing that is neither. For what it's worth, you read that right. First time I looked at those photos I knew you read it right, James said. I appreciate you picking up anytime, Gary said. I mean that. Anytime. The line closed. James set the phone on the windowsill. Outside, the bus route ran its cycle again. Another stop. Different people. The city moving through its Friday with no awareness of and no interest in what had happened on the 48th floor of one building. Among thousands, or in the basement of that same building, or in a 1-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, where a man who cleaned floors for a living had sat at a kitchen table at 7 in the morning and decided that knowing something was the same as being responsible for it. The dead plant was still on the fire escape across the alley. James made a mental note to bring a new one up for his own windowsill sometime this week. It seemed like a reasonable thing to do. 72 hours. That was how long it took for the full shape of the thing to become visible, not the outline. The outline had been clear from the moment Agent Ramirez walked out of that conference room with Ronald Sanchez ahead of her and the warrant copy in Kenneth Lee's hands. A man had been stealing. The man had been caught. The company had not dissolved on a Friday morning, the way everyone assembled in that room had come prepared to watch it do. But the full shape, the depth of the betrayal, how far it reached, how many hands had touched it besides Ronald's that took 72 hours. The FBI forensic team arrived Saturday morning with 3 agents and equipment enough to conduct a complete audit of Crestline's server infrastructure. They worked through the weekend with the methodical quality of people who have learned that speed produces errors, errors produce appeals, and appeals produce outcomes that serve nobody. Sandra stayed in the building both days. Not because anyone asked her to, because she could not be anywhere else, while this was happening inside the walls of something she had built. She watched them work through the small rectangular window in the server room door, and what she felt watching them was not relief. Relief implies the danger has passed. What she felt was closer to the first full breath after a long illness, the awareness of a system beginning to function again. Oxygen moving through channels that had been narrowed for so long the narrowing had come to feel normal. The first finding came Saturday afternoon. 214 confirmed file transfers from Ronald Sanchez's account over 91 days. The forensic lead, a compact agent named Okafor, who communicated exclusively in declarative sentences and appeared to have stripped all unnecessary language from his vocabulary, sometime early in his career summarized it for Sandra in the corridor outside the server room. Every transfer confirmed, every timestamp verified, every file classification matched. The selection of documents corresponded precisely to the proposal elements Crestline had submitted in each of the 4 contracts Harlow Defense Group had subsequently won. Not approximately, precisely. Sandra stood in the corridor and listened to the precise language of a confirmed catastrophe, and thought about the number 18 months. The time her engineering team had spent preparing the federal defense contract submission. The architects who had rebuilt the core technical framework 3 times to get it right. The legal team that had reviewed every line for compliance. Every hour of it had been transmitted to a competitor in a series of transfers from the account of the man who had stood beside her when they thought they were going to win that contract. They had not won it, because by the time the submission was evaluated, Harlow already had the blueprint. The second finding came Sunday morning, and it was the one that explained everything the first had left open. Brian Thompson, 29 years old, mid-level IT technician in Crestline's infrastructure maintenance division. 3 years and 2 months with the company, hired out of a certification program at a community college in Naperville, Illinois. Quiet, competent, unremarkable in the way that someone specifically trying to be unremarkable achieves unremarkability not through absence of ability, but through careful management of visibility. Brian Thompson had installed a customized log suppression script in Crestline's anomaly detection system 14 weeks before the first documented download from Ronald's account. The script did not delete the access logs. It allowed them to continue generating exactly as they always had. But it prevented the bulk download triggers from escalating to the automated alert system that would have flagged the activity for the IT security team within the first week of the first transfer. This was why 2 independent audit firms had found nothing. They had reviewed the alert system. The alert system had nothing to report because Brian Thompson had ensured, 14 weeks in advance, that it would have nothing to report. The raw logs themselves, the ones Sandra had been watching scroll on her monitor in the dark at 2 in the morning, had been there the entire time. Accessible to anyone who went looking in the right place, with the right permissions and the patience to read what they found. No one had gone looking, until a man who was not supposed to understand what he was looking at walked through a door he had no reason to open and understood it in under a minute. Brian Thompson was arrested at his apartment in Naperville on Sunday morning by 2 agents who arrived at 7 a.m. and found him at his kitchen table. He did not run. He did not argue. He looked at the warrant, then at the agents, then at the bowl of cereal in front of him, with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific knock on a specific door for 14 weeks. and is experiencing something close to relief that the waiting is finally over. "I need to call my mother," he said. He cooperated fully from that point forward, and his cooperation was thorough. By Sunday evening, the FBI had a complete picture of the financial architecture. Ronald Sanchez had established a consulting entity under a name bearing no visible connection to him, a standard Delaware incorporation, post office box in Wilmington, business account opened with a wire from a personal savings account he had held since his 20s. Larry Torres, senior vice president of business development at Harlow Defense Group in Atlanta, had been routing payments to that entity since the arrangement began. The payments were structured to stay individually below federal reporting thresholds, not perfectly, but close enough that the pattern only resolved into something legible when viewed as a series: $2,940,000 over 14 months. The number landed in the conference room Monday morning, with the physical weight of something released from a height, and the 9 board members absorbed it in the silence of people processing a figure that is simultaneously larger and smaller than expected. Larger because it was real and documented and specific. Smaller because it meant the man who had spent 14 months dismantling a billion-dollar company had done it for less than $3 million. Sandra found that number instructive in a way she did not try to explain to the room. Greed does not operate proportionally. People do not betray according to what a betrayal is worth in any objective sense. They betray according to what they were offered at the moment when what they wanted. Most came into alignment with what was available. Ronald Sanchez had apparently wanted at some point in the past 14 months enough certainty about his financial future that the calculation had seemed worth making. He had made it wrong. Kenneth Lee called the Monday session to order. His voice had shed something since Friday, the practiced weight of chairmanship, the slight performance that had always accompanied his authority in this room. What remained was quieter and more direct, the voice of a man who had sat for a weekend with the knowledge that he had been about to ratify a fraudulent outcome and was now operating with the specific sobriety that produces. He asked Sandra what she needed from the board. She told him, bankruptcy filing formally withdrawn. Authorization for the legal team to file an immediate civil injunction against Harlow Defense Group. Executive Committee to convene a full compensation and authority review for every department head operating under interim capacity. Because gap filling by committee had a shelf life and they were already past it, Kenneth Lee nodded once. Done. It was, Sandra thought, the most efficient board meeting Crestline had ever held. The injunction against Harlow Defense Group was filed on Wednesday. The Department of Defense suspended Harlow's federal contract on Thursday. Pending review of the procurement integrity investigation in a 1-paragraph notice in the Federal Register that would have passed without attention in ordinary circumstances. These were not ordinary circumstances. The notice ran alongside news coverage of Ronald Sanchez's arrest that had moved through the business press with the velocity that corporate espionage stories achieve when they involve a defense contract, a named COO, and a company with a trajectory that people had been following. A separate item, buried in the same reporting, noted that Ronald Sanchez and a Harlow executive named Larry Torres had been indicted on federal charges, with trial dates to be set. Crestline's name was in every story. Sandra's name was in most of them. James Smith's name was in none of them, which was exactly the arrangement he had been promised and the one he preferred. He read the coverage Wednesday evening from the chair by the window in his apartment in Pilsen, the same chair, the same window, the same view of the street below, where things moved and stopped and moved again, with the indifference of a city that had not noticed anything unusual had happened inside one of its buildings 4 days ago. The reporting was accurate in its broad structure and imprecise in its details in the way that business journalism about active federal investigations is always imprecise, because the precise details are sealed in warrants and case files in the jurisdiction of people who do not speak to reporters before deadline. Company nearly destroyed from the inside. COO arrested. FBI investigation. Federal contract suspended. Competing firm under indictment. He read it and felt less than he expected to feel, which surprised him until he understood why. He had already processed the weight of it, had processed it between 2:30 and 7 on a Friday morning while the building ran its routines around him, and the city outside did its ordinary things. The coverage was the public version of something he had already sat inside privately. It was louder and more dramatic than the private version, and also more remote, the way a photograph of a place you know well is simultaneously recognizable and strangely flat. He went to work Thursday night, clocked in at 10, picked up his cart from the basement supply room, rode the service elevator to the 40th floor to start his rounds. He'd been reassigned there temporarily, while the FBI team completed their work on 48, which remained an active evidence site, requiring coordination between the forensics team and building management, that the facilities coordinator had described to James with the exhausted precision of someone navigating a situation for which no protocol existed. The building felt the same. That was what he noticed first, and it stayed with him through the shift. He had half expected some atmospheric residue, some perceptible difference in the quality of the air, the sound, the texture of moving through a space where something significant had happened. Buildings do not work that way. They register temperature and occupancy and the presence or absence of people who have somewhere to be. They do not register events. The building felt like a building. James felt like himself, which was itself something new or not new, more accurately, but renewed. A recurrence of something that had been present before and had been absent long enough that its return was noticeable. The specific sensation of his own competence being active and present and useful, the way a tool that has been sitting on a shelf for a long time feels different in the hand when you finally pick it up again. Not strange, the opposite of strange. Familiar in the way that things belonging to you feel familiar when you have been without them long enough to have half convinced yourself they belong to someone else. He vacuumed the 40th floor, restocked the supply closets, wiped down the glass conference room walls on the east side of the building, where the morning light came through at an angle that left everything faintly fingerprinted by afternoon. He did his job. The same job he had done for 3 years and 7 months without anyone knowing or caring that the man doing it had once done something else entirely, and had not, in fact, stopped being capable of it. 3 weeks after the arrest, the forensics team released the 48th floor. The building management coordinator sent James a note through the internal maintenance system, the same channel used for supply requests and floor assignment changes, informing him that his regular assignment had been restored effective the following Monday. He read the note on his phone in the basement and put the phone back in his pocket and went back to organizing the supply shelves. It occurred to him, sometime in the middle of arranging cleaning products in an order that satisfied a private organizational logic he had developed over 3 years of working this space, that he had spent a very long time being comfortable with the idea that this basement and these shelves and this cart were the appropriate scale for what remained of him. That the reduction had been fair, that the man he had been in Arlington was someone the events of the subsequent years had correctly sized down. He finished the shelves. He stood back and looked at them. Then he went upstairs and finished his shift. Sandra Anderson found him on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks and 2 days after the arrest, 5:15. She came down to the basement, still wearing the blazer from the attorney briefing she had come from, her hair slightly less precise than it had been at the start of a day that had begun before 7, the way 15 hours of concentrated attention gradually undoes whatever the morning intended. She had asked building security where the night maintenance staff for the upper floors could be found during off hours, and the security associate had given her a look that managed to be respectful and entirely baffled in equal measure, before directing her downstairs. James had his back to the door when she walked in. He was arranging cleaning products on the wire shelving alphabetically, which no protocol required but which satisfied a specific organizational instinct that had no other outlet in this job, and that he had stopped apologizing for, internally, sometime in the 2nd year. He heard the door open. He turned around. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment, which was appropriate given that they had never spoken and were meeting now in a basement supply room, under circumstances that no organizational chart or employee handbook had ever been designed to address. Sandra did not apologize for walking in without knocking. She had knocked on enough wrong doors in 23 years to have stopped treating the habit as something requiring apology. She said, "I know what you did. I wasn't asleep that night. I heard the camera. James held her gaze. I didn't do it for the company. She waited. Because that sentence required what came after it, and she was not going to provide it for him. He looked at the shelf beside him, then back at her. I saw it, and I couldn't pretend I didn't understand it. That would have been a different kind of lie than the ones I was already telling myself. And I was running low on the energy those take. She was quiet for a moment, not searching for a response, but allowing what he had said to settle before she did anything with it. There was a difference, and she recognized it in herself. I want to offer you a position. Doing what? Leading a new internal division. Ethics and integrity operations. Data access monitoring. Anomaly detection. Making certain that what happened to this company from the inside cannot happen again without someone identifying it before it reaches the boardroom. He did not say yes. He looked at her with the expression of a man running a systems check on his own reaction before delivering it. Are you offering because you think you owe me something? Her answer came without pause and without softening. I'm offering because you were the only person in this building who looked at the truth and acted on it. Not because it was your job. Not because anyone asked. Not because there was anything in it for you. One beat of silence. Everyone else in this building was either not seeing it or protecting something. You were neither. James looked at the shelf for a moment longer. Then at her. Give me 2 days. She nodded once and walked back to the elevator without elaborating, because elaborating was not how either of them operated, and they had already, without discussing it, established that much about each other. He stood in the supply room after she left and listened to the elevator arrive and the doors close and the mechanical sound of it ascending. He thought about what she had said. Not the offer was clear and specific, and he would think about it properly later. He thought about the thing. Before the offer, the way she had said it, everyone else was either not seeing it or protecting something. The precision of that, the fact that she had identified the 2 failure modes exactly and had placed him outside both of them, and had done it without making it a compliment, just a statement of what had happened. He picked up a bottle of surface cleaner from the wrong shelf and moved it to the right one. Then he went upstairs and finished his shift. He called Emma that evening, not her regular Tuesday or Thursday. A Wednesday unscheduled, which meant Laura answered first, her voice carrying the quality of someone prepared to be concerned but open to being reassured. James said nothing was wrong, he just wanted to talk to Emma. Laura said one moment in a way that contained, in its 2 syllables, the complete history of 2 people who had cared about each other, and then had not, and were now navigating the permanent middle geography of raising someone they both loved from different cities. Emma's voice came on bright and immediate, as though she had been mid-thought and was happy to redirect it toward this. You're calling on a Wednesday. I'm calling on a Wednesday. Something happened. Something happened. She waited. Because Emma, at 12, had already understood something that most adults took decades to learn, that the most useful thing you can do when has something to say is to stop filling the air and let them say it. She had learned it in her, faster than knew. He told her. Not the legal architecture of it, not the federal statutes or the forensic methodology, the shape of it. A night, a dark office, a screen full of information he was not supposed to be able to read and could read anyway, because that was the kind of thing that did not leave you, even when you spent 3 years telling yourself it had. A choice between the version of himself that kept walking and the version that reached into his back pocket. Emma listened without interrupting. When he finished, the background sounds of the house in Richmond filled the silence, the refrigerator running. Something on a television in another room, and beneath it the soft sound of movement that he eventually identified as the dog Laura had gotten 8 months ago, which James had only heard through phone speakers and had not yet seen close enough to properly assess. Then Emma said, "You've always been that person, Dad. You just forgot." He had been expecting something more age-appropriate. Something along the lines of "that's really cool," or "were you scared?" Not this, not the complete absence of decoration, not the flat certainty of it, the way she said it like a thing she had known for a while, and was finally being given the right moment to set down where he could see it. You've always been that person. You just forgot. James sat at his kitchen table with the phone against his ear and looked at the dark window and the yellow square of light from the apartment across the alley where someone was moving around, a kitchen doing something completely ordinary. He could not speak for a moment, not because he was overwhelmed by it, but because the sentence was doing several things at once, and he needed a moment to let all of them arrive. It was a correction and an absolution and a form of loyalty that he had not earned in the past 3 years and had not asked for, delivered by a 12-year-old who had not yet learned to portion out the things she believed about people she loved. He said, "I'll come see you next month. Maybe sooner if I can arrange it, Emma." "Okay. Also, I got 100 on my science test. James, tell me about it." And she did for 11 minutes, covering the test format, the question she had almost gotten wrong because she second-guessed herself. The fact that her lab partner had gotten a 94 and was being very normal about it. And James sat at his kitchen table in Pilsen and listened to all of it with the specific attention of a man who understands, more clearly than he did 2 weeks ago, that listening is not a passive activity and that he has not always done it as well as he should have. He called Sandra Thursday morning. She picked up on the second ring. He said, "I'm taking the position," she said. "Monday, 8 a.m., he said, "I'll come to the lobby." A brief pause. "I'll meet you there." 5 sentences. In those 5 sentences, something was renegotiated that neither of them named directly the terms of how this new arrangement would begin, which was not with him arriving on the 48th floor as the man who cleaned it, but with him arriving in the lobby as someone who had a reason to be there that had nothing to do with a cart or a mop or the particular invisibility he had cultivated. Across 3 years of night shifts, she understood the distinction without being told. He noticed that she understood without telling her he had noticed. Monday morning. The lobby of Crestline Systems at 8 a.m. had the quality of a space that has resumed normal operation after a period of disruption and is faintly self-aware about it. The revolving door brought a gust of November cold in with him. As he entered Chicago in late November, doing what Chicago does, the lake wind finding the gaps between buildings with the patience of something that has been doing this since before the buildings were there. The lobby screen had been updated. The dual portrait, 2 faces, 2 names, the words "leadership you can trust" in the font someone had chosen years ago, and no one had questioned since was gone. In its place was a single image, not a portrait. The Chicago skyline seen from elevation, looking east over Lake Michigan. The city and the water meeting at the horizon in the flat gray light of early winter. Below it in plain type, Crestline Systems. Integrity in infrastructure. James stood in front of it for a moment. He was wearing a suit he had owned for 4 years and worn 6 times. It still fit well enough to constitute professional, which was the bar he had set, and which he was satisfied with, and he was carrying nothing except his phone and a folded piece of paper on which he had written 4 questions he intended to ask before agreeing to any operational parameters for the new division. Because he was not walking into this arrangement without understanding what he was walking into. The version of him that took what was offered without establishing the terms first had made a series of decisions across his 30s that he had spent his 40s paying for. That version had graduated. He was not enrolled in that program anymore. Sandra came off the elevator at 8:03. A different blazer than the one from the basement, Tuesday dark gray, precisely fitted, and her hair back to the precision it had not quite achieved at 5 in the afternoon 3 weeks into a federal investigation. She crossed the lobby toward him with the same forward-leaning efficiency he had glimpsed across 3.5 years of night shifts in her building, had seen on the lobby screen above his head hundreds of mornings, and was now encountering at human distance for the first time. She stopped in front of him, extended her hand. He shook it. She said, "You have questions." He glanced at the folded paper, then at her. 4 of them. "Come upstairs." They went upstairs. The position had a reporting structure, a budget allocation, and a charter document that Sandra's attorneys had drafted over the previous week, with the specific legal architecture required for a function that had not existed before and needed to be built correctly from the beginning rather than retrofitted later. James read every page at the conference table, while Sandra answered emails at the far end, without pretending she was not answering emails, which he appreciated more than he would have appreciated the pretense. He asked his 4 questions. She answered 3 directly. The 4th concerning the division's authority to escalate findings to the board independent of the executive team. She said, would require a board conversation she would schedule before the end of the week, and she said it in the tone of someone who intended to have that conversation and was not using it as a deferral. That works, he said. Ethics and integrity operations. 3 staff positions to be filled in the first quarter. Budget for infrastructure upgrades that would embed anomaly detection directly into the log architecture, rather than maintaining it as a separate alert layer. The approach that, as Brian Thompson had demonstrated with 14 weeks of advanced preparation, could be circumvented by someone with sufficient access, sufficient motive, and the patience to work quietly. James had specific ideas about the architecture. He had been thinking about it in the way that he had apparently never stopped thinking about systems, even during 3.5 years of telling himself that chapter was finished. And the ideas were detailed, and technically sound in a way that would have been recognizable to anyone who had worked with him in Virginia, as the output of someone who understood infrastructure security from both sides of the problem. He presented them the following Tuesday to Crestline's IT director and 2 senior engineers, using a whiteboard and 40 minutes and no presentation deck, because the ideas were clear enough that a deck would have been a reduction rather than an aid. Derek, 26, and visibly carrying the weight of someone who had spent the past 3 weeks knowing his company's systems had been compromised, without being able to explain how, listened, with the focused attention of a person receiving information they have needed for longer than the conversation has been going. When James opened the floor, Derek asked 7 questions in sequence, each one building from the previous answer, and James answered all 7 without breaking the thread. When the meeting ended, Derek stood in the corridor outside the conference room and looked at James with an expression that was trying to resolve something. "Where have you been?" he said. James said, "Downstairs." Derek opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "That's not I mean." He stopped. "Okay, yes, welcome," which was, James thought, an entirely sufficient welcome. The annual address happened in February. Crestline held it every year in the main auditorium, on the ground floor, a room that seated 400 and typically held 350, when you counted the people standing along the back wall because they had not arrived early enough for chairs. Sandra had given this address 8 times before. She had never given one without notes. She gave this one without notes. The room filled the way it always filled: engineers along the left, sales team through the center, support and administrative staff toward the back, the maintenance and security crews, taking seats nearest the exits in the way that people who work unconventional hours occupy any seating arrangement, light on the commitment, close to the door. February in Chicago meant the revolving entrance had been cycling cold air into the lobby all morning, and the auditorium was still working back to a comfortable temperature when Sandra walked to the podium. James sat in the 4th row. He had been at Crestline in his current capacity for 3 months, long enough for his presence on the 48th floor to have become ordinary, in the way that anything becomes ordinary when it happens consistently. He was still calibrating the suit situation, still navigating the specific adjustment required when a man who has spent years moving through rooms without registering in them becomes someone whose presence in a room carries context and weight. It was not an uncomfortable adjustment. It was simply a real one, and it was ongoing. Sandra looked at the room, all of it. Not the front rows, not the section of directors and department heads, but all of it, and did not speak immediately. The room noticed. Rooms notice when something is calibrated differently than expected, and this was. Then she said, "1 year ago this month, I sat in my office at 2 in the morning pretending to be asleep. The auditorium went quiet. Not the managed quiet of a corporate event, say. The real kind, the kind that settles when something has been said that people did not know they were waiting to hear. I was pretending because I had stopped trusting anyone. Not the board, not my executive team, not the conclusions I was being walked toward or the explanations I was being given. I had been running this company for 23 years, and I had reached the point where the only test I could think to run was the most basic one available. I turned the lights down and I closed my eyes and I waited to see what the people around me would do when they believed. No one was watching." She gripped the edges of the podium. "The person who answered that question was not in the boardroom. He was not on my executive team. He was not on any organizational chart I had ever looked at or any succession plan I had ever reviewed." She paused, not for effect, but because the next sentence required its own space. He was the person who cleaned my office every night for 3.5 years, whose name I had never learned, whose face I would not have recognized in an elevator. The quiet in the room deepened. He walked in with a cleaning cart, and he saw something on my monitor that most of the people in this building, people with advanced degrees and titles that took multiple lines to fit on a business card, had either missed or decided not to look at too closely. He saw it. He understood exactly what it was. And then he made a choice that I have thought about every day since, because it was not a safe choice, and it was not a required choice, and there was nothing in it for him except the cost. She let a moment pass. He did not make that choice because someone asked him to. No one asked him. He made it because he was the kind of man who cannot look at a wrong he knows how to name and persuade himself that naming it is someone else's responsibility, and that quality unglamorous, costly, not something that shows up on a resume or gets discussed in a performance review, is the reason this company is standing in this room today, instead of in the middle of a dissolution proceeding that would have erased 23 years of work. She looked at the room. All of it. I spent 23 years building Crestline. I almost lost it because I had come to believe, without examining the belief, that the most important people in this building were the ones with the most important titles. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about it in a way I intend to spend the next 23 years correcting. One more pause. Shorter, the person who saved this company was not the smartest person in the room that night, was not the highest paid, was not the person with the most authority or the most to gain. He was the person who still had enough integrity to use the knowledge he carried in the dark, alone, with no audience and no guarantee of any outcome except the one that comes from doing what you know is right. She stepped back from the podium. The silence held for 2 full seconds after she stopped speaking. Then someone in the 3rd row began to applaud. Then the 2nd row. Then all of it, the whole room, the kind of applause that begins because it is the right response and continues because it is also the true one, building from the front toward the back until it reached the maintenance and security crews near the exits, who joined it without moving toward the door. James sat in the 4th row with his hands on his knees. He did not stand, did not raise a hand, did not do anything except sit there and let the sound move through the room around him while he looked at the woman at the podium and thought about the night she was describing, which he remembered differently than she did, as a sequence of small practical decisions made by a cold and tired man who was not entirely certain his hands were going to stay steady. Both versions were true, his version and hers. The one in which he was a man doing the only thing the situation made available, and the one in which that thing was more than it appeared. He had not been brave. He wanted to be precise about that, at least to himself. Brave implies you measure the fear and proceed in spite of it. He had not measured anything. He had looked at a screen, and his hands had already known what to do before the question had fully formed, the way his body had known how to read those logs before he consciously chose to read them. Some knowledge, held long enough and deeply enough, does not require a decision in the moment. It only requires the person carrying it to be present when the moment arrives. He had been present, that was the whole of it. The applause was continuing. Sandra had stepped down from the podium, and the house lights had come up slightly, and the room was beginning the shift from stillness to motion, conversations starting at the edges, people turning toward each other, the particular ambient sound of several hundred people resuming their days with something new to carry in them. James sat for one more moment. He thought about the lobby screen he had passed on the way in this morning, the skyline, the lake, the plain type beneath it that made no mention of titles and said nothing about the people at the top, only about what the company intended to stand for in the distance between who it had been and who it was becoming. He thought about Emma's voice on a Wednesday phone call. 7 words delivered with the unguarded certainty of someone who has not yet learned to doubt the things she knows about the people she loves. You've always been that person. You just forgot. He stood up. Around him, the room was moving. An engineer he had been working with on the new detection architecture stopped at the end of his row. "Good speech," he said. James said, "It was." The engineer nodded and moved on. James moved on 2 down the row, up the aisle, through the auditorium doors and into the lobby, where the February light was coming through the glass facade at a low winter angle, laying itself across the floor in long pale sections that reached almost to the elevator bank. He walked through it, not invisible, not performing visibility. Just present in a building where he had spent 3.5 years being no one the building needed to account for, walking toward a floor where he now had work to do that no one else in the building was positioned to do, carrying knowledge that had always been his, and that he had only recently stopped pretending belonged to some earlier version of himself that no longer applied. He pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. He went up.